and welcome to the Nightmare Vault. If these stories, along with the sound of rainfall, help relax you or help you drift off to sleep, please consider liking, subscribing, and comment below where in the world you call home. Okay, let's get on with the stories. I became a doctor because I wanted to help people. It sounds cliche, I know, but for me, it was true. Growing up, I watched my mother struggle with a chronic illness, and I felt helpless as I saw her pain. The doctors and nurses who cared for her were like heroes to me, and I wanted to be like them, to make a difference, to take away the suffering of others. So I dedicated myself to my studies, worked hard, and finally, after years of school and training, I became Dr. Harris, a resident at one of the busiest hospitals in the city. I was fresh out of med school, eager, maybe a bit naive, but ready to take on the world. The hospital was huge, a labyrinth of corridors and departments, and it was easy to get lost in the constant rush of patients, staff, and the never-ending cycle of life and death. I thrived in the chaos, soaking up every experience, every lesson, determined to prove myself. But nothing in medical school had prepared me for what I was about to face. It started with small things that seemed like the usual mishaps in a busy hospital. A ventilator malfunctioned during a critical moment, and the patient who should have been stable died. A defibrillator failed during a code, and a man who could have been saved was lost. A syringe supposed to be full of life-saving medication was found empty just when it was needed most. Each incident was brushed off as bad luck, the kind of things that happen when there are so many moving parts in a place like this. But the mishaps kept happening, and the so-called bad luck started to feel more like a pattern. The hospital was old, its infrastructure a mix of outdated equipment and hastily implemented upgrades, a patchwork always under strain. The administration chalked it up to the hospital's age, to inevitable wear and tear, to human error. They said it was a streak of unfortunate events, nothing more. But I wasn't so sure. I was in my first year of residency, still learning the ropes, still finding my footing. But even then, something about these incidents felt wrong. They weren't random. They seemed to target the most vulnerable moments, the times when a life hung in the balance. It was like someone was toying with us, with the lives we were trying to save. I couldn't shake the feeling that these so-called accidents weren't accidents at all. I started paying closer attention, keeping a mental note of each incident, trying to find a pattern. The more I looked, the more unsettling the picture became. The failures weren't spread out evenly. They were concentrated in specific wards during specific shifts. And there was something else, something that sent a chill down my spine. In nearly every case, the same nurse was present, a man who had been at the hospital longer than anyone else on staff. He was well-liked, respected even, but there was something about him that didn't sit right with me. When I brought my concerns to the administration, they dismissed them. They said I was being paranoid, that I needed to learn to deal with the chaos of the hospital. They assured me that everything was under control, that the nurse in question was one of their best. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe that I was just seeing connections where there were none, that the hospital wasn't under some kind of malevolent influence. But I couldn't, so I kept digging, quietly on my own time. I started watching the nurse more closely, following his movements when I could, trying to piece together what was really happening. It wasn't long before another incident occurred. A routine surgery turned deadly when the anesthetic machine malfunctioned. The patient, an otherwise healthy woman, never woke up. The room had been checked and double-checked before the operation, but somehow the machine failed at the worst possible moment. And there was that nurse again, standing in the corner, his face unreadable as he watched the chaos unfold. I knew I had to find out more. I started asking around, carefully, casually, about the nurse's history. Most people spoke highly of him, saying he was reliable, that he'd seen everything and knew how to handle any situation. But there were whispers too, whispers about a time when he had been in trouble, when his actions had been questioned, a time when he had nearly been fired. As I dug deeper, I discovered that he had, in fact, been terminated, only to be quietly rehired a few weeks later. The official reason was vague, something about a misunderstanding, but there were hints of something darker. An incident that had been covered up, a mistake that had cost someone their life. It didn't take long for the pieces to start falling into place. The nurse had been let go after a particularly egregious error, but he hadn't gone quietly. There were rumors that he'd made threats, that he blamed the hospital for ruining his career, his life. And then, just as suddenly, he was back, his position restored, the incident erased from the official records. The more I watched him, the more I was convinced that he was the one behind the sabotage, but there was no concrete proof, nothing that would hold up to scrutiny. I knew I had to catch him in the act, to gather undeniable evidence that he was the one responsible for the deaths. Then I found something even more disturbing. A list buried deep in the hospital's old records of equipment orders that had been canceled or altered at the last minute, always by the same person. The nurse had been tampering with the equipment for months, maybe even years, and no one had noticed. It was clear he was planning something bigger, something catastrophic. I didn't know what, but I knew I didn't have much time to stop it. The next few days were a blur of fear and frantic preparation. I stayed late, hiding in the shadows of the hospital's labyrinthine corridors, waiting for him to make his move. The hospital was eerily quiet at night, the only sounds the distant hum of machines and the occasional footsteps of the night staff. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited, every creak of the floor making my pulse race. Finally, I saw him. He was moving quickly, purposefully, toward the operating wing. I followed at a distance, staying out of sight. He slipped into a supply room, and I crept closer, peering through the crack in the door. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. He was tampering with the oxygen supply to the operating rooms, adjusting the levels to a point that would be fatal during surgery. My blood ran cold as I realized how close he was to carrying out his plan, how many lives were hanging in the balance. I knew I had to act fast, but just as I was about to confront him, he turned, as if sensing my presence. Our eyes met, and in that moment I saw the full extent of his madness. There was no remorse, no hesitation, only a cold, calculated determination. I fled, my mind racing as I tried to think of what to do. I couldn't let him get away, but I couldn't stop him on my own. I needed help, but who could I trust? The administration had already shown they were willing to look the other way, to cover up the truth. Desperate, I made my way to the security office, praying that the night guard would believe me. I burst in, breathless, explaining everything as quickly as I could. To my relief, the guard took me seriously, calling for backup and heading straight to the operating wing. We arrived just in time. The nurse was still in the supply room, his back turned as he finished his work. The guard approached him cautiously, but before he could react, the nurse lunged, pulling a scalpel from his pocket. In the struggle, he was overpowered, but not before he made one last, desperate attempt to finish what he'd started. The guard managed to stop him, securing him until more help arrived. In the aftermath, the truth finally came to light. The nurse had been quietly sabotaging the hospital's equipment for months, slowly escalating his actions in a twisted revenge plot. He had intended to cause a disaster, something that would force the hospital to shut down, to pay for what he believed they had done to him. The hospital administration tried to downplay the incident, but the damage was done. The truth couldn't be buried this time. The nurse was arrested, and the hospital's reputation was left in tatters. As for me, I stayed on at the hospital for a while longer, but the experience changed me. I learned that even in a place dedicated to healing, darkness can take root. I learned that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from outside, but from within. And I learned to trust my instincts, because in the end, they were all that kept me alive. I'd been working as a nurse at the hospital for years, long enough to know every corner, every creak of the floor, every detail of the building's history, or so I thought. It was an older hospital, built in the early 20th century, and despite the renovations over the years, it still carried the weight of its age. The walls had seen countless lives come and go, and there was an unspoken understanding among the staff that the hospital held its secrets that were better left undisturbed. That winter was particularly harsh, colder than usual. and the night shifts felt even longer. The hospital was quieter at night, almost unnervingly so. The bustling energy of the day gave way to an eerie stillness, where the only sounds were the distant hum of machines and the occasional shuffle of a patient's footsteps. I'd grown used to the quiet, even found a certain peace in it, but lately something had changed. The air felt heavier, charged with a tension I couldn't quite place, like the calm before a storm. It all started one night when I found myself in an unfamiliar part of the hospital. It wasn't unusual to wander during the quieter hours, to check on things or simply clear my head. But this time I ended up somewhere I'd never been before, in a wing of the hospital that had long been closed off. The door to the old wing was supposed to be locked, but that night it was ajar. A thin sliver of darkness peeking out, almost inviting me in. My hand hesitated on the doorknob, my instinct screaming to turn back. But something, curiosity maybe, or just the restless energy of the night, pushed me forward. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The air was different, stale, heavy with dust, and cold in a way that sent a shiver through my entire body. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit and lined with old, faded tiles. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The further I walked, the more isolated I felt, as though I had stepped into another world entirely, one that wasn't meant to be found. As I ventured deeper, small details began to set my nerves on edge. An old gurney pushed against the wall, its wheels rusted and squeaking slightly as I passed by, a broken light fixture that flickered sporadically, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Every step forward felt like a step further from safety, and yet I couldn't turn back. The air grew colder, each breath a struggle against the tightness in my chest. Then I came to a door at the end of the hallway, different from the others. It was a heavy metal door with a small, grimy window set into it. The plaque above the door had been scratched out, leaving no indication of what lay beyond. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the handle, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. Something inside me screamed to turn back, to leave and forget I had ever found this place. But I couldn't. I had to know what was behind that door. The door creaked open with a loud grating noise, and I stepped inside. The room was small, dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. There were no windows, and the walls were bare, save for a few faded spots where it looked like something had once hung. In the center of the room was a metal filing cabinet, its drawers slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry and hadn't bothered to close them properly. I approached the cabinet, my breath shallow and my hands trembling. I pulled open one of the drawers, and inside I found a stack of old files, their edges yellowed with age. I flipped through the files, my eyes scanning the contents, and what I found made my blood run cold. These were patient records, but not like any I had seen before. They were incomplete, with large sections blacked out or torn away. The records detailed experimental treatments, procedures that were far from ethical, conducted on patients who had been admitted decades ago. The dates on the files were from the 1970s, a time when the hospital had been under different management, and from what I could gather, these patients had been used as guinea pigs for medical trials that had gone horribly wrong. The more I read, the more sickened I became. These weren't just medical experiments. They were brutal, invasive procedures that had left the patients scarred, both physically and mentally. Many of them had never been discharged, their records ending abruptly with no explanation. It was as if they had simply disappeared. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead as I stared down at the pages. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't stop reading. I had to know how deep this went, how far the hospital had gone to cover up its sins. I was so engrossed in the files that I almost didn't hear it, a soft, shuffling sound from the hallway behind me. My blood turned to ice, and I froze, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, like someone was slowly making their way toward me. Panic surged through me, and I shoved the folder back into the cabinet, my heart racing. I felt trapped, as if the walls were closing in on me. I backed away from the table, glancing around the room for an escape, but there was none. The only way out was the way I'd come in. The hallway beyond the door was now filled with shadows. The flickering light did little to dispel the darkness that seemed to be closing in. I knew I had to get out, had to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, frozen in place by the terror that gripped me. Then I saw it, a figure at the far end of the hallway emerging from the darkness. But I could feel its gaze locked onto me, a cold, malevolent presence that sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't make out its face, but I knew deep down that it was connected to the horrors in those files, that it was the reason this place had been sealed off for so long. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in the cold, oppressive silence. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching me, as if daring me to make the first move. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. Finally, I broke free of the paralysis that gripped me. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing loudly in the narrow hallway. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing thicker, heavier with each step. I could hear the figure behind me, its footsteps slow and deliberate, as if it knew there was no escape. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled up the stairs, my legs burning with the effort. I burst through the door at the top of the stairs, slamming it shut behind me. The corridor was just as I had left it, quiet, empty, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I could still feel the figure's presence, lingering just beyond the door, waiting for me to make a mistake, to come back. I didn't tell anyone what I had found. Who would believe me? The hospital's dark past was buried deep, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and time. But I knew it was still there, lurking in the shadows of that abandoned wing, waiting for someone else to stumble upon it. And I knew that whoever or whatever was behind it would do anything to keep it a secret. But the story doesn't end there. The next night, as I tried to focus on my work, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that figure again, but the hallways remained empty. Still, the sensation of eyes on me never left. I thought maybe it was just paranoia, a lingering effect of what I had discovered, until I found the note. It was slipped under my locker door, a single piece of paper, folded neatly in half. My hands shook as I unfolded it, dreading what I might find. The message was simple, written in a hurried scrawl. Stay out of the old wing. This is your only warning. My blood ran cold. Someone knew I had been there. Someone was watching me, and they wanted to make sure I never went back. I knew then that the secrets hidden in that abandoned wing were darker and more dangerous than I had ever imagined. But the thought of leaving it alone, of letting those horrors remain buried, gnawed at me. For the next few days, I tried to push the thoughts out of my mind, but the paranoia only grew. Every shadow seemed longer, every sound more sinister. The phone calls started soon after. Late at night from an unlisted number. The first few times, I ignored them, but the ringing never stopped. When I finally answered, there was nothing on the other end, no words, just the sound of breathing. Then, a soft click as the line disconnected. Someone was trying to scare me, and it was working. I knew I had to make a choice. Forget what I had seen, or dig deeper, knowing full well the risks. But I couldn't let it go. I started looking into the hospital's history, trying to find any records of the experiments that had been conducted, any mention of the patients whose lives had been destroyed. But the more I searched, the more roadblocks I encountered. Files were missing, records were incomplete, and people who had worked at the hospital during that time were either dead or refused to talk. One night, unable to shake the feeling that I was close to something, I decided to return to the old wing, hoping to find more answers. I knew it was risky, but I couldn't let the truth stay buried. As I made my way down the familiar hallway, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, I felt that same oppressive weight bearing down on me. The door at the end of the hall was closed, just as I had left it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I pushed the door open and stepped inside the small room once more. The air was even colder than before, and the flickering light bulb above cast long, distorted shadows on the walls. I went straight to the filing cabinet, but when I opened the drawer, it was empty. The files were gone. Panic surged through me. Someone had been here, someone who knew what I had found and had taken it to keep me from uncovering the truth. I spun around, my mind racing, and that's when I saw it, a small, folded piece of paper on the table where the files had been. My hands trembled as I picked it up, unfolding it slowly. The message was short, written in the same hurried scrawl as the previous note. "Leave it alone. This is your final warning." I dropped the note, my hands shaking. They knew I was here. They were watching me. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in around me. I had to get out. I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the cold, hard floor as I fled the room, the hallway, the stairwell, until I was back in the main hospital, my heart racing and my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't go back to the old wing after that. I couldn't. The hospital carried on as it always had, with patients coming and going, doctors and nurses doing their rounds. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was keeping an eye on me, waiting for me to slip up. The next few weeks were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. I avoided the old wing like the plague, but the sense of dread never left me. I knew that whoever had left those notes wasn't finished, that they were just waiting for the right moment to strike. My nerves were frayed, my thoughts consumed by the horrors I had uncovered, and the fear that it was only a matter of time before the past caught up with me. Then, one night, as I was finishing up my shift, I found another note. It was in my locker again, but this time it was different. There was no hurried scrawl, no warning. It was a single line typed neatly on a plain piece of paper. "You were warned." My heart dropped. I knew then that I had gone too far, that there was no going back. The fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks suddenly exploded into full-blown terror. I wasn't safe. Nowhere was safe. I grabbed my things and left the hospital, not caring about the shift, the patients, or anything else. But the story doesn't end there. Even after I left, the paranoia stayed with me. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. The hospital had buried its secrets deep, and whoever was behind it was willing to do anything to keep them hidden. I moved to a different city, changed my name, and tried to start over. But the nightmares followed me, and so did the phone calls. Late at night from unknown numbers with nothing but silence on the other end. The fear never left, and I knew it never would. Because the truth is, some things are better left buried. The hospital may have hidden its dark past, but those secrets are still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And for anyone who dares to dig too deep, the consequences are terrifying. I'd always been healthy, the kind of person who rarely got sick, who never had to worry about more than the occasional cold. I kept active, ate well, did everything the doctor said you should do to stay in good shape. That's why when the dull, persistent pain started in my abdomen, I tried to ignore it. It was just a cramp, I told myself, or maybe something I ate that didn't agree with me. It would pass, it always did. But it didn't. The pain grew worse over the weeks, nagging at me, gnawing at my insides until I could barely stand it. It was a strange kind of pain, deep and throbbing, something that felt wrong, like my body was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't quite understand what. I'd never felt anything like it before, and that scared me more than I wanted to admit. Eventually, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I went to my doctor, a man I'd known for years, someone I trusted. He ran a few tests, felt around my abdomen, and told me it was probably nothing serious, but that we should do some imaging just to be sure. He referred me to a specialist, a surgeon at a hospital I'd never been to before, but he assured me they were the best. "It's routine," he said. "In and out. You'll be back on your feet in no time." I believed him. The hospital was big, cold, sterile. It had that smell, that antiseptic scent that clings to your clothes long after you leave, a smell that always made me a little uneasy. But the staff were friendly enough, the nurses smiling as they checked me in, guiding me through the pre-op procedures like it was just another day. For them, it probably was. They prepped me quickly, efficiently, and soon I was lying on a gurney, staring up at the bright, white lights of the operating room. The anesthesiologist came in, a man with a calm, reassuring voice. He explained what would happen, how I'd feel a bit of cold gas, then nothing, how it would all be over before I knew it. I nodded, trying to stay calm, trying to ignore the growing pit of anxiety in my stomach. The mask was placed over my face, and I took a deep breath, the gas filling my lungs, cold and sharp. My vision began to blur, the edges of the room fading, The voices of the nurses and doctors becoming distant, muffled like they were underwater. And then everything went dark. At least, it was supposed to. I don't know how much time passed before I began to wake up. It was slow at first, like swimming up from the bottom of a deep, dark pool. I felt groggy, disoriented, like I was half dreaming, half aware, but then the fog in my mind started to lift, and I realized something was wrong. I shouldn't have been awake. Panic gripped me as I tried to open my eyes, tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was trapped inside myself, completely paralyzed, unable to do anything but lie there, helpless, as the sounds around me grew clearer. I could hear voices, close by, but they weren't the comforting tones of the doctors I'd heard before. These voices were different, colder, more clinical, detached. I strained to understand what they were saying, but the words came slowly, fragments of sentences slipping through the haze, something about organs, about extraction, about prices. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but the words didn't fit together, didn't make any sense. Why were they talking about organs? What were they doing to me? And then I felt it, a sharp, intense pain in my side, like a hot knife slicing through me. It was sudden, excruciating, and I wanted to scream, to cry out, but no sound came. I was trapped in a body that wouldn't obey me, overwhelmed by the pain and terror that was rising inside me. My heart pounded in my chest, every beat a painful reminder that I was still alive, still feeling everything they were doing. The voices continued, calm, methodical, as if they didn't care that I was awake, that I was aware. They talked about me like I wasn't even there, like I was just a piece of meat, something to be carved up and sold off. They mentioned my kidney, my liver, the quality of my organs, and how much they could fetch on the market. My mind reeled, the realization hitting me like a freight train. I wasn't in a hospital. I was in some kind of place where people weren't healed, they were used. My body wasn't mine anymore. It was inventory, parts to be sold to the highest bidder. And I was awake for all of it. I tried to thrash, to move, to fight back, but nothing happened. I was locked in my own body, able to feel everything, but unable to stop any of it. The horror of it, the sheer helplessness was overwhelming. The pain in my side faded, replaced by a cold, spreading numbness, but my mind was still racing. They weren't in a hurry. They were taking their time, careful, methodical. They needed me alive, at least for now. I heard them discussing their next steps, what to take next, how to keep me stable enough to harvest the organs they needed. Each word was like a death sentence. Each decision, another part of me they would strip away. Then they mentioned another patient, someone they had lined up for after me. A young woman, they said, in perfect health for what they needed. The way they talked about her, so casually, so heartlessly, it made me sick. I wasn't their only victim. There were others, so many others, who had walked into this place just like I had, trusting, unsuspecting, only to be betrayed, butchered, and sold off in pieces. I was going to die here, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Time blurred. The pain came and went, waves of agony and numbness rolling over me as they continued their work. My mind began to fray at the edges, the horror and helplessness consuming me. But I clung to one thought, one desperate hope. I had to survive. I had to find a way out of this nightmare, to escape before they finished me off. But how? How could I escape when I couldn't even move? I don't know how long it went on. It felt like hours, days, and eternity. But then, just as the darkness began to swallow me whole, I heard something. A sound. Distant at first, but growing closer. It was different from the voices around me, different from the cold, mechanical noises of the room. It was a voice, frantic, urgent, shouting something I couldn't quite make out. And then everything exploded into chaos. The room was filled with noise, shouts, crashes, the sound of running feet. The pain in my side flared again, but this time it was joined by a surge of adrenaline, a jolt of life that snapped me back to full awareness. I could hear people shouting, orders being barked, someone screaming, and then the pressure on my side was gone, the cold hands pulling away. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing. I had a chance. I had to move, had to get out before they realized I was still alive. I fought against the numbness, the paralysis that held me in place, willing my body to respond, to move, to do anything. And then slowly, agonizingly, I felt my fingers twitch, just the slightest movement, but it was enough. I forced my eyes open, the room spinning into view, blurred and distorted, but there. The lights were blinding, the figures moving around me just shadows, but I could see them. My captors, the ones who had been carving me up, and the others, the ones who had burst in, who had stopped them. There was a struggle, hands grappling, a scuffle of bodies. I didn't care who they were, I just needed to get out. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed myself up, my body screaming in protest, the pain almost unbearable. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I stumbled off the operating table, my legs barely holding me, but I kept going, driven by sheer terror, by the primal instinct to survive. The room tilted, the floor seemed to rise up to meet me, but I stayed on my feet, moving toward the only exit I could see. I made it to the door, my vision darkening at the edges, my breath ragged and shallow. Behind me, I could still hear the chaos, the sounds of the struggle, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I had to keep going, had to get out before they caught me, before they finished what they'd started. I don't remember how I got out of the hospital. The memories are a blur of pain and fear, of cold air hitting my face as I stumbled into the night, of hands grabbing me, lifting me, pulling me to safety. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a different hospital, a real one, with real doctors who looked at me with a mix of pity and horror. They told me I was lucky to be alive, but I didn't feel lucky. I felt hollow, like a shell of the person I'd been before. They told me I'd been found unconscious in an alley, barely clinging to life, dumped there like garbage. The surgeons had done what they could, but they couldn't undo what had already been taken from me. My kidney, parts of my liver, and who knows what else. The physical scars were deep, but the emotional ones cut even deeper. I couldn't escape the memories, couldn't shake the feeling that I was still in danger. The hospital staff treated me with kid gloves, their voices soft, their words carefully chosen. They kept telling me how brave I was, how I was a survivor. But all I could think about was how close I had come to dying, to being completely erased. I tried to give the police everything I could remember, but the details were fuzzy, distorted by the pain and the drugs. They took my statement, nodded sympathetically, promised to do everything they could to catch the people who had done this. But I could see it in their eyes. They didn't have much hope. They'd seen too many cases like mine, where the perpetrators vanished without a trace, leaving only broken bodies in their wake. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, my body began to heal, but my mind didn't. I was haunted by the faces of the people who had been in that room, their cold, clinical expressions as they carved me up piece by piece. I kept hearing their voices in my head, the way they had talked about me like I was already dead, like I was nothing but merchandise. I couldn't stay in the hospital. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on that operating table, trapped and helpless. The doctors wanted me to stay longer, to recover, but I couldn't. I needed to get out, to be somewhere that didn't smell like antiseptic and death. I left, against their advice, and went back to my apartment, hoping that being in familiar surroundings would help. But it didn't. The first night back, I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, sure that they were in the room with me, ready to finish what they'd started. I tore through the apartment, checking every lock, every window, convinced that they were watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. But I was alone. The place was empty, silent, but the fear wouldn't leave me. The next few days were a blur. I barely slept, barely ate. I jumped at every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every shadow that moved across the walls. I knew it wasn't rational, but I couldn't help it. The fear had rooted itself deep inside me, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake it. Then the calls started. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me. But then I realized it was real. The phone would ring, and when I answered, there was nothing but silence on the other end. No words, just the faint sound of breathing, cold and deliberate. It happened at all hours, day and night. A constant reminder that they were still out there, still watching me. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, that it was just some sick prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. They hadn't forgotten about me. I was supposed to be dead, but I wasn't. And that meant I was a problem, a loose end that needed to be tied up. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't just sit around and wait for them to come for me. I had to do something. I couldn't let them win, couldn't let them finish what they'd started. So I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started digging into my own case, trying to find anything that could lead me to the people who had done this to me. I went through the police reports, talked to anyone who might have seen something, might have known something, but it was like trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Everything was just out of reach, every lead a dead end. And then one day I found it, a name, buried deep in the files, connected to a string of unexplained disappearances at hospitals across the country. It was the same pattern, patients with minor issues vanishing without a trace, or reappearing broken, mutilated, barely alive. The police had missed it, or maybe they hadn't cared to look that closely. But I saw it, and I knew it was them, the same people who had done this to me. I knew I couldn't go to the authorities. They'd already failed me once, and I couldn't just sit back and wait for them to come for me again. So I made a decision. Expose them, stop them before they could hurt anyone else. I didn't care about the risks anymore. I couldn't live with myself if I did nothing. It wasn't easy. They covered their tracks well, and every lead I followed seemed to end in a dead end, or worse, a warning. A threatening note left on my doorstep, a message scrawled across my car's windshield. Stop looking. But I couldn't stop. Not after what they'd done. Not after everything I'd lost. Finally, I tracked them to a small, rundown clinic in a forgotten part of the city. The kind of place where no one asks questions, where people disappear without a whisper. I knew I had to be careful, but I was beyond fear now, driven by something colder, something that burned with the need for justice, or maybe revenge. I watched the clinic for days, learning their routines, who came and went, how they operated. And then one night, I saw it. A van, unmarked, pulling up to the back entrance. 2 men dressed in scrubs, wheeling out a stretcher covered with a sheet. I knew what was under that sheet. I knew what they were doing, and I knew I couldn't let them get away with it. I followed them, my heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I didn't have a plan, just a desperate need to stop them. But as I got closer, as I crept toward that van, the reality of what I was doing hit me. They had already taken so much from me. Was I really ready to risk it all to confront them head on, knowing what they were capable of? But I couldn't turn back. I couldn't let them win. I approached the van, my hands shaking, my breath shallow, and then, just as I was about to make my move, one of the men turned, his eyes locking onto mine. In that moment, everything seemed to freeze. Time stopped, the world went silent, and all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, thudding in my chest like a drum. He recognized me. I could see it in his eyes. He knew who I was, what I was trying to do. And he smiled, a slow, cold smile that sent a shiver down my spine. I was too late. Before I could react, I felt a sharp pain in my neck. A needle, and then the world tilted, the ground rushing up to meet me. My vision blurred, the shadows closing in, and the last thing I heard was their voices, calm, collected, as they carried me back to the van. When I woke up, I was back in a hospital bed, but this time, I wasn't alone. The same man who had smiled at me was standing over me, his expression cold, detached. He told me that they'd been watching me all along, that they knew I'd come looking, and that now I'd pay the price for digging too deep. I don't know what they did to me after that. I don't want to know, but when I woke up again, I was in a different place, an anonymous room. My body was weak, broken, missing more than just a kidney now. They left me here to die, alone, forgotten, just another victim in their endless cycle of horror. But I'm still alive. They didn't finish the job, and as long as I'm breathing, I'll keep fighting, keep looking for a way out, for a way to make them pay for what they've done. I know they're still out there, and I know they're coming for me. But this time, I'll be ready. This time, I won't let them win. In 2019, my life was pretty straightforward. I was 34, living alone, with a steady job in finance that kept me busy and a small circle of friends. I wasn't the type to get sick often, so when the pain in my side started, I brushed it off. Just a muscle strain or something I ate. But the pain grew worse, sharper, until it was impossible to ignore. Finally, I saw a doctor, thinking it was something minor. The doctor they assigned me to was young and confident. Dr. Matthews. He had that kind of easy charm that made you feel like you were in capable hands. After some tests, he diagnosed me with a minor issue that required a routine surgery. In and out, he said. You'll be back to your life before you know it. The hospital was old, with faded green walls and flickering lights that gave it an unsettling atmosphere. The corridors were long and eerily quiet, the kind of place where you could feel the weight of the building's history pressing down on you. Still, it was just a quick surgery. I'd be out before I knew it. The surgery went as planned, or so I was told. When I woke up, the pain had dulled to a manageable throb, and the nurses assured me everything was fine. I was groggy but relieved, thinking the worst was behind me. That's when Dr. Matthews started showing up more often than expected. At first, it seemed normal, checking on me, making sure the pain was under control. But his visits became more frequent and his questions more personal. He seemed overly interested in my life, where I lived, who was visiting me, how I spent my time. His eyes lingered too long, his touch too familiar. Something felt off, but I tried to ignore it, convincing myself I was overreacting. One night, I woke up to find Dr. Matthews sitting in a chair by my bed, watching me. The room was dark, and my heart skipped a beat when I realized he was just sitting there, staring. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me with those piercing eyes. When he noticed I was awake, he stood up quickly, muttering something about checking my vitals. But the way he hurried out left me cold, a sinking feeling settling in my gut. The next day, I asked a nurse if it was normal for Dr. Matthews to check on patients in the middle of the night. She shrugged, saying he was very dedicated, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something like doubt. I started to dread his visits, the way he seemed to study me, like I was more than just a patient to him. Suspicious, I decided to look him up. What I found chilled me to the bone. Buried deep in the search results were articles about women who had been under Dr. Matthews' care. Women who had come in for routine procedures and never left. The reports were vague, full of medical jargon, but the pattern was clear. These women had either disappeared or died from mysterious complications, with Dr. Matthews being the last person to see them alive. My mind raced. I realized I wasn't just being paranoid, I was in danger. I knew I had to get out of that hospital, but I couldn't just leave. I was still recovering, still weak. Every day I felt more trapped, like a fly caught in a web. The hospital walls seemed to close in around me, the air thick with an unspoken threat. I could sense it in the way Dr. Matthews hovered, his presence becoming more oppressive with each passing day. I waited until the middle of the night when the hospital was at its quietest. My plan was simple: discharge myself, get a cab, and disappear. But as I swung my legs out of bed, the door creaked open, and Dr. Matthews stepped into the room. I froze. He was smiling, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You shouldn't be out of bed," he said softly. My heart pounded as I mumbled something about needing the bathroom, but he shook his head, stepping closer. "I'll help you," he said, his voice cold and detached. He reached out to steady me, but I pulled away, panic surging through me. My legs felt like jelly, but I knew I had to escape. I bolted past him, running down the hallway in my hospital gown, the cold floor tiles biting at my bare feet. I could hear his footsteps behind me, quick and determined, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I reached the elevator and frantically pressed the button, praying it would arrive before he caught up. The doors slid open just as he rounded the corner, and I threw myself inside, jamming the close button. The last thing I saw before the doors shut was his face, twisted in anger, his eyes dark with something far more sinister than I had ever imagined. The elevator ride was the longest of my life. My heart pounded, the pain in my side flaring with every movement. All I could think about was getting out, getting away. When the doors finally opened, I stumbled into the lobby, nearly collapsing from the effort. I made it outside and into a cab, telling the driver to take me anywhere. As we sped off, I looked back at the hospital, at the dark windows that seemed to watch me with a malevolent gaze. I knew I was lucky to be alive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. In the weeks that followed, I tried to report what happened, but no one believed me. The hospital denied everything, insisting Dr. Matthews was a respected physician. The records of the women I found were suddenly gone, erased as if they never existed. I was left questioning my sanity, wondering if it had all been a nightmare. But I knew the truth. I had seen the darkness behind Dr. Matthews' eyes, felt the cold dread that gripped me in that room. He was still out there, still working, still finding his next victim. And no one would ever know because no one wanted to believe a doctor could be a monster. I moved to another city, far from that hospital, far from the memories that haunted me. But even now, I can't shake the feeling he's still watching. still waiting. And every time I see a doctor, that cold fear returns, reminding me I might not be so lucky next time. The hospital had always been more than just a place of work for me. It was like a second home, a place where every corridor and every room held memories, some good, some haunting. I'd been there long enough to remember when the walls were painted a different color, when the old wing was still in use, when a certain doctor used to walk these halls, a doctor who'd long since retired. I took pride in the care we provided, in the sense of calm we could offer in the midst of chaos. I'd seen families torn apart and then sometimes miraculously put back together. I'd watched patients fight for their lives and win, and I'd held the hands of those who didn't make it. In all of it, there was a sense of order, a predictable rhythm that I'd come to trust. The night shifts especially had a peculiar charm. The hospital seemed to breathe differently once the day staff had gone. The bustling wards turned quiet, the lights dimmed, and it felt like the building itself was finally resting. It was during these hours that I felt most at peace. It was also during these hours that I noticed things that others didn't. I wasn't one to jump at shadows or let my imagination run wild. After all, I'd seen enough real horrors in my line of work. But there was something about that winter, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, that made the night shifts feel different. Maybe it was the way the darkness lingered a bit longer, or how the cold seemed to seep into the walls, making everything feel just a little bit off. And then there were the patients. Normally I'd have a pretty good idea of what to expect during my rounds, who was stable, who needed more attention. But that season, something changed. People were coming in with minor issues, nothing serious, but they weren't leaving. Not alive anyway. It was subtle at first, a patient here, another there. But the more it happened, the more I started to feel that unease growing inside me. I never thought I'd be someone who'd have to question my own mind, my own instincts. I always believed that I'd see things clearly, especially in the hospital where everything is supposed to make sense, where everything follows a certain order. But that was before I noticed the patients. It started subtly, just a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. I've worked night shifts long enough to know how the shadows can play tricks on you, how the eerie silence can make you hear things that aren't there. But this was different. There was this patient, an elderly woman, admitted for something routine. I remember her because she was so sweet, always thanking the staff, always smiling despite her condition. And then one night, she was gone. It was sudden, unexpected. They said it was complications, that it happened sometimes, but something about it didn't sit well with me. It was the look on her face when I checked on her earlier that evening, almost like she knew what was coming. I should have said something then, but I didn't. I just brushed it off. I tried to convince myself I was just overworked, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. Another patient, younger this time, admitted with a broken leg. He was doing fine, chatting with the nurses, even joking about how he'd managed to trip over his own feet. And then, just like that, he was gone. A cardiac arrest, they said. An anomaly. But his face, too, had that look. I couldn't get it out of my head. That's when I started paying closer attention to the patients, to the staff, to the small things that didn't add up. At first, it was just a vague sense of unease, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. But the more I watched, the clearer it became. There was a pattern. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, buried beneath layers of routine and normalcy. But it was there, lurking just below the surface. The patients who died, they all had one thing in common. Each of them had been under the care of a particular staff member, a nurse I'd never thought much of before. She was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of person who blended into the background, who you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for her. She did her job well, efficiently, without fuss. But as I started to watch her more closely, I realized something was off. It wasn't just the patients who were dying. It was the way she was with them before it happened. I'd see her linger in their rooms longer than necessary, her hands moving with an unsettling precision. She seemed too involved, too focused on their pain, like she was more interested in their suffering than in easing it. There was something in her eyes, a coldness that made my skin crawl, something I hadn't noticed before. It was as if she was studying them, watching them struggle, as if she knew exactly what was going to happen and was waiting for it. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. How could someone so unassuming, someone I'd worked alongside for years, be capable of such a thing? But the more I watched, the more the pieces fell into place. The slight smile she'd give when she thought no one was looking, the way she'd double-check their charts, almost as if she was planning her next move. It was like a predator stalking its prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Every time I saw her enter a patient's room, my heart would race, my stomach would knot. I started dreading the quiet nights, those moments when it was just her and the patients, when no one else was around to witness. I knew I had to be wrong. I had to be. But then another patient would die, and I'd see her again, that same look in her eyes, that same eerie calm, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was witnessing something truly horrifying. And I began to notice other things, too. Small, seemingly insignificant details that now took on a much darker meaning. The way she'd sometimes pause outside a room as if listening for something, or how she'd always volunteer for the most critical patients, the ones who were hanging on by a thread. And then there were the syringes, the way she handled them, the way she seemed to know just how much to administer to push someone over the edge without raising suspicion. It was all there, hiding in plain sight, and I was the only one who could see it. But what if I was wrong? What if I was letting my imagination get the best of me? The thought gnawed at me, kept me awake at night, but every time I walked those halls, every time I saw her, the dread would return, stronger than before. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know how to begin, how to prove that what I was seeing was real and not just some figment of my exhausted mind. And the more I hesitated, the more I wondered, how many more would die before I found the courage to act? And then came the night that changed everything. I was doing my rounds, checking on patients like I always did, when I heard something. It was faint, almost like a whisper, coming from one of the rooms down the hall. I shouldn't have gone in. I should have turned around and pretended I didn't hear anything. But I couldn't help myself. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, my blood ran cold. The nurse was standing over a patient, syringe in hand, her expression calm, almost serene. The patient was unconscious, completely unaware of what was about to happen. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched, frozen in place, unable to make a sound. She didn't see me, didn't know I was there. But I knew what she was doing. I backed out of the room, my mind racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I wanted to scream, to run, but I knew I couldn't. I had to act normal. I had to pretend I hadn't seen anything, or she'd know. But how could I pretend when I knew what she was capable of? When I knew that every minute I stayed silent, another patient was at risk? I reported it, of course. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. But they didn't believe me. They said there was no evidence, that I was overreacting, that it was impossible. The nurse continued her shifts, continued to care for patients, and I continued to watch, powerless as more of them died. But then, just as I was about to give up, something changed. There was a patient, a man in his 50s, admitted with a minor infection. He was doing well, expected to be discharged in a few days. But then I saw her, that nurse, slipping into his room late at night when no one else was around. My heart raced as I followed her, every instinct screaming at me to stop her, to confront her right there and then. But I knew I couldn't. What if she had something else planned? What if she wasn't alone? What if she knew I was there? I waited until she left, then rushed into the room. The patient was still breathing, still alive, but I knew she had done something. I searched the room, desperate to find any proof, any sign of what she'd done. But as I rummaged through the drawers, a horrible thought crossed my mind. What if I was wrong? What if this was all in my head, and I was about to accuse an innocent person? But then I found it. The syringe, hidden beneath the bed, still half full of a clear liquid. I took it to the authorities, showed them what I'd found. This time, they listened. This time, they couldn't ignore the evidence. The nurse was arrested, charged with multiple counts of murder. They searched her home, found more syringes, more evidence. She had been doing it for years, killing patients one by one with no one the wiser. I should feel relief knowing she's behind bars, knowing she can't hurt anyone else. But I don't. I feel haunted, knowing how close I came to saying nothing, to letting her continue. And I wonder, every day, how many more are out there, just like her, hidden in plain sight, waiting for their next victim. And then there's the lingering fear that keeps me up at night. What if I missed something? What if she wasn't working alone?